Want to be on the frog and toad to a great vintage knit? Check out a pattern for a tea and food. Hey there, Fiber Junkies! Welcome back to the Color Cauldron. I'm Johanna, the owner and dyer behind Potion Yarns and host of this podcast. And today we have another installment of Saturday Night at the Movies. I'm so excited that the first one went over so well a couple weeks ago. I had so many great compliments and great feedback, positive feedback, people excited about it, a lot of new subscribers, and I'm just thrilled that you guys enjoyed it as much as I did. And so we're going to do another one. I know that the first one was only a couple weeks ago, so this is actually coming out much sooner than I'd originally planned, but I wanted to change my schedule of Saturday Night at the Movies to closer to the beginning of the month as opposed to the end of the month for a very practical reason, which is that this year in my shop, if you're not already aware, we are doing yarn clubs where each month I introduce a yarn color that is an exclusive limited edition colorway based around and inspired by a star of the silver screen era, so from the 1920s to the 1960s of old Hollywood. Each month we pick a different star, and since most of these stars were working in black and white films, some in colored films, but many of them in black and white films, and most of them were in scads and scads of movies, so it's hard to narrow it down to just one film or one costume or something. Rather than doing a specific colorway based on a photo of the star, I'm using colors that are popular at the time that the star was in their heyday, mixed with colors that evoke more of the moods and the personalities of the stars that inspired it. So for January, our very first yarn club, we did Rosalind Russell, who is an amazing actress that I absolutely love, and our Saturday Night at the Movie was one of the films featuring her from The Women in 1939. Her keywords, or things that described her personality and the roles that she often played, were things like sassy, bold, confident, modern, career girl, fast-talking, independent, those kinds of words. So the colorways that we chose, since everyone's received their yarn now, I can tell you, were deep teals and bright dark blood reds and kind of like a nice neutrally grayish brown. So a lot of really sophisticated, mature, bold, intensely saturated colors with a lot of high contrast because her personality was very bold and very independent and aggressive. So for this month, we are doing another star that I absolutely love from the old vintage era, Cary Grant. And his keywords are things like, the yarn colorway is called Debonair. And then his keywords are things like suave, classic, sophisticated, urbane, mature, manly, confident, very elegant man. Elegance is one of the words that I used for his yarn. So I'm not going to give you sneak peeks this time, but the reason I wanted to move our Saturday Night at the Movies up a little bit was I wanted it at the beginning of the month so that for the months where our yarn club colorway coincides with the film that we're doing, I wanted you to still have time to go and pre-order the yarn clubs that we're doing for that star. So like last month we did Rosalind Russell, we chose a Rosalind Russell film, but the movie review came out after you could no longer order the clubs. And I felt like that just wasn't fair. That was kind of like teasing you and getting you all excited, maybe introducing you to a new star if you weren't familiar with them, but then you don't get the opportunity to order their yarn club. So I am doing it at the beginning of the month, and you have until the 15th of each month to order the that month's yarn club. So you'll have a little bit of time still to order Cary Grant. Alrighty, so let's get into this month's movie review. I'm very excited about this, and if you missed the last one, here's what we do for Saturday Night at the Movies. Each month I'm going to choose a different film that features knitting, wool, sheep, or something related to fiber and fiber arts. Now usually this means that knitting is not a huge part of the plot, although sometimes it is, like in this month's selection, but a lot of times it's not even mentioned technically. It's just a minor little random scene, someone knitting in the background of a scene, or someone mentioning something having to do with knitting or wool or sheep or something along those lines, just in passing or as like a scene in the film, but it's not the overarching plot. However, I will always keep my eye out for films that have knitting as a primary part of the plot, and if you know of any, old or modern, send them to me. The other thing that we do, not just mentioning the movie, but we talk a little bit about like history or relevant, interesting information about the film, if there's anything extra that we want to add in, and we always pair a themed or coordinated pattern. The idea is you can be knitting on this pattern while you're watching the film, and it kind of goes with it. Either it's from the era, like last month before our 1939 film, I was knitting a cute little beret, and I actually had it all finished, a little tam hat. And so I was wearing it on the podcast. I showed it to you, gave you a link to where you can go buy the book that features that pattern. And if I may not always have a finished object complete, but if I find great patterns, I'll at least show you and give you links to where you can find the pattern, and I will show you if I'm knitting on it in progress or if it's done or whatever. Also, if you haven't met Phoebe yet, this is Phoebe. She's one of my 3 sweet babies, and she loves the camera, so she's always around when we're filming. So welcome back, Phoebe. Okay, so let's talk about our selection this month. We already talked a little bit about our star of the month, which is Cary Grant. If you guys are not familiar with Cary Grant, he is amazing, he is suave, he's fabulous, he's one of my very favorite stars, and he's just the epitome for many people of sophistication, elegance, and suavity. He was always perfectly matched, and one of the things that makes him one of my very favorite stars is that I've never in my life seen anyone who was better at managing to inhabit a role and fit in with whatever film or role he was doing and look so natural at it. He was hard to categorize. He did dramas, he did comedies, he did melodramas, he did romantic comedies and chick flicks. He did everything, and he was good at everything he did. He was just so good at fitting into a role and making it his own, but really he was an incredible actor with an amazing range and skill set. Some of my very favorite films of Cary Grant's are from his early years in the 1930s and early 40s when he was very young, very handsome, and he was into a lot of screwball comedies. He also did a bunch of dramas and melodramas, and he played a lot of bit parts, and when he very first got started in the early 1930s, he actually played opposite Mae West in a couple films as kind of like the young, fluffy hunk of you-know-what that she could grab, and she had some kind of raunchy body films, and he played the young, dashing, handsome man that couldn't stay away from her and that she seduced in those films quite well. But he quickly graduated into starring roles, and he got very good at screwball comedies and hilarious laugh-out-loud comedies from that era, and those are some of my favorite films of his. He has a rapid-fire delivery that's just fabulous, especially in films like His Girl Friday, which also features Rosalind Russell from last month, by the way. He was hilarious, and he did really good at being very, very flustered and funny. One of my favorite films of his is Bringing Up Baby with Katharine Hepburn, where he's just this flustered, dorky, bespeckled little I don't know what you call him, paleontologist, I guess, where he works with dinosaur bones and stuff, and he's just so like proper and stuffed shirt and easily flustered, and her like high-spirited rambunctiousness at going after him when she falls for him is just, it has him constantly flustered and sputtering, and it's just so cute and funny, and he's so good at it. So he was amazing in comedies throughout his entire career. But he was also amazing at dramas. He played the bad guy as well as he played the good guy. One of my favorite instances of him being the bad guy is in an Alfred Hitchcock film from the early 1940s called Suspicion, and his wife suspects that he is slowly poisoning her to take over her money. It's a really great film, and I highly recommend you check that out. He was really creepy as the villain and really wonderful as the romantic lead and the leading man, the hero. So he's fantastic. He was one of Hitchcock's favorite actors to work with, and you see him showing up in many Hitchcock films over the span of a couple decades, and he always was absolutely fantastic. They were a match made in heaven. He was born Archibald Alec Leach in England back in 1904. He died in 1986, which coincidentally is the year that I was born. He actually died a couple weeks after I was born. But he was born and named Archibald Leach, and in some of his early films, you actually hear these hilarious little references that he ad-libbed or added in. Like one of my favorites is in His Girl Friday. He talks about something about Archie Leach. And that was actually a reference to his name growing up. He was always interested in the theater. He started acting as a young child, and he got into vaudeville in the 1920s. And then when he came to America in the 1930s, he hit Hollywood and started working very hard and immediately caught notice and got into some little bit parts in films and very quickly propelled into major supporting roles and then leading roles as well. And he never went out of style. He was always good in all of his films. His name was always a box office draw. I don't know if he ever had a movie that flopped, but if he did, it certainly wasn't because of him. He was amazing. One of my favorite quotes I found when I was doing research on him was Edith Head was a very, very prominent costume designer in Hollywood. She worked on almost every old movie during the 30s and 40s and 50s, and her career started super early and spanned on into the 60s and 70s. She was amazing. She was really the big name of Hollywood costume design. There were a few other large ones, but she was probably the biggest. And she said that she loved working with Cary Grant and dressing him in films because, in her opinion, he had more style than any other actor she'd ever dressed in her entire career. So she was very much a fan of his fashion sense and the way that he wore his clothes and always looked so comfortable in them and was so elegant, and apparently he was very good at working with her. Edith Head was known to have a little bit of a large ego, and you couldn't really tell her a whole lot, and she did have some feuds going on with some of her more opinionated stars who clashed and butted heads with her, but Cary Grant always managed to work with her very well, and he gave opinions, which she very much respected. Obviously, she thought he had a great fashion sense, so he was able to give input and opinions and help offer suggestions and get to wear the things that he wanted to wear. But his fashion sense was so good, and he did it in such a wonderful way where he really partnered with her and didn't make her feel threatened as the designer, that they got along great and loved their working relationship together. So I thought that was kind of a cool little interesting bit. Another thing I loved was I found that his daughter actually quoted him as saying that he always claimed he did everything in moderation. He stayed fit and physically looking amazing up until he died. And people were always wondering what his secret was. And he said, well, I wouldn't attribute any one thing to it because I always do everything in moderation. I don't go whole hog over anything. And that's how I stay fit and stay great and stay relevant, and I'm able to do so many great roles because I do everything in moderation except for making love. What a great quote, right? That's amazing. So today's film that we are doing is Mr. Lucky, starring Cary Grant from 1943. Mr. Lucky was a film made during World War II, and it's hard to classify it as like a comedy or a drama. It's a little bit of both, kind of like The Women, actually. I would say that it's less of a comedy than The Women, the one we did last month, but it is still quite funny, and it has a lot of very funny scenes, but it's kind of a comedy drama combo. But as many films made during World War II, a lot of the films made in the early 1940s were made with a very patriotic sense, or scenes added in or dialogue slipped in or enhanced to really drive home that sense of patriotism and all of us working together, that sense of hope and that sense of good overcoming evil. That's actually one of the things I love about the films made during the 1940s and the World War II era. I absolutely love that so many films made during that era really focused on a positive, hopeful sense. It was all about instilling hope into people even in the midst of the darkest times, about having us all stand together, band together to fight evil, to resist things coming into our world that we're not okay with, and to fight injustice. And I really, really love that sense from the 1940s. Unlike some of the other eras in our nation's history, of the United States at least, I feel like the 1940s films from World War II do a really good job of, for the most part, you can always find a few that don't fall in line with this, but I feel like most of them do a great job of focusing on like fighting evil, but not necessarily fighting people, if that makes sense. I feel like there are other times in our nation's history, there's always going to be flare-ups of chaos and times when the world seems like it's going topsy-turvy. You know, the late 1960s and the Vietnam War and all of that was one of those other times. And it felt like back then things were a little more jaded and not so hopeful and not so positive. And it really devolved easily into fighting people, not necessarily just fighting the evil or fighting the ideas or fighting the excesses that people can commit. And I kind of feel like that's going on in our world right now, actually. I feel like a lot of people are very passionate about fighting injustice and evil, and I'm totally for that, but I think that we need to be really careful to remember that we all have good and evil inside of us, and we all have the capacity for good or for evil, and that it's very important not to fight, not to see it as us versus them. It's very important to see it as good versus evil, not us versus them. We all have the potential to flip and become the thing that we hate and fight against, and I think it's really important that we're careful about that. So that's one thing I love about the 1940s films, is I feel like a lot of people don't realize this. You really have to watch them with a more of an open mind and without so much chronological bias, where we take our modern attitudes and we look back on old things and we judge them by our modern standards and what is popular or trendy or acceptable today. And I think it's really easy to look back on old movies and judge them with a chronological bias instead of looking at them for what they were and with the cultural context at the time, and taking the good and celebrating that, and then learning from the things that we don't appreciate or that we don't like, and pushing those away, right? So anyways, all that to say, this is a great example of 1940s World War II film that I believe had a lot of patriotism in it without the propaganda that could sometimes creep into other films. There's probably a little bit in there, but I feel like it's mild and harmless if there is any at all. It's mostly just about patriotism and banding together and fighting evil. And I really love this film because there's a theme of finding meaning. What is it that gives your life meaning? What are you doing that means something at the end of the world? When you die, what have you done that left the world a better place, or that contributed to society, or that was valuable and noble and something for people to look up to and revere, instead of just, getting whatever you can out of life? That's kind of the overarching theme of this film. So, quick synopsis. In this film, Cary Grant is the star. He plays a guy named Joe the Greek Adams. He's a gambler, he's a grifter, he has no ties or connections. He's kind of a jaded, hard, street savvy, come up through the ranks, probably came from nothing, and just is out to make a buck, get whatever he can, right? In the beginning of the film, we see him running this gambling ship, and he has a partner working with him. In the very beginning, one of their underlings that works for them dies. And in going through his wallet and his ID cards and stuff, they find out that this guy, whose name is Joe Boskopoulos, he's a Greek man, and he has a card in his wallet called a 4F card. Now, during World War II, men were getting drafted. And if you had something that exempted you from serving in the army, like some kind of physical reason that you couldn't fight, so this guy has a 4F card in his wallet. The two guys that own the ship, so Joe Adams and his partner, both have just received draft notices, so they have to report for duty and could get drafted into the army and go overseas to fight in the war. They don't want to go. They just want to, they're not patriotic at all. They don't care about anyone else. They don't care about their country. They have no loyalty or ties. They're just out to make a buck. And if they have to go fight in the army, they're not going to be able to make any money, right? So they're trying to get out of going to report to the draft when this guy dies, and they find this 4F card in his wallet. And so Joe Adams tells his partner, hey, if one of us takes this, we could take on this guy's identity, and we could pretend that we're him, so we wouldn't have to report for duty. We could just present our 4F card and get out of it, and then only one of us has to go serve in the army, and the other one can keep our gambling ship going. So they decide this is a good plan, and in order to decide who gets to take the card and get out of duty, they decide to gamble for it. The partner tries to screw over Cary Grant's character, whose name is Joe Adams. We're just going to call him Joe for this one. So the partner decides to screw over Joe, but Joe figures it out and does a bait and switch and manages to still win their gamble. And so he takes the 4F card, and the other guy has to report for duty. Turns out when he reports for duty, he's unfit for military service because he can't pass the physical anyway, so he's rejected, and he ends up not having to join the army, so nobody has to go. In the meantime, Joe Adams has taken on the identity of Joe Boskopoulos, the Greek guy. So now he's pretending to be this Greek man named Joe Boskopoulos. He has his ID card and basically steals his identity. He's in this small town, and he runs into this gal who's raising money for the local war relief effort. And he decides that he is going to join forces with the war relief effort in order to make some money. He needs some money to run his gambling ship, and he's trying to figure out how he can get it. And he runs into her. They're selling tickets for this charity ball. And he decides, hey, this is a great idea. So he goes to the head of the War Relief Organization, which is a gal named Veronica Stedman, who is played by the absolutely superb character actress Gladys Cooper. And she's a game old gal and kind of a good spunky sport. So he manages to convince her that he is Mr. Lucky. He cannot possibly lose. So if she ties her star to him, they will definitely make money, even though his idea is to run a gambling evening for her charity event. So people would pay money and they'd come in and they'd gamble, and the idea is, oh, it's all good, clean fun. Even though gambling is illegal, they will look the other way, and all these high society types will come and gamble anyways because their money is going to the war relief effort. So it's a charity thing, right? So he convinces her this is a great idea, and she goes against the advice and better judgment of her second in command, which is a high society gal named Dorothy Bryant. Dorothy is played by Lorraine Day, who was another fabulous 1940s actress, and she's a pretty tough cookie. She's a high society dame. She is pretty. She is very feminine and girly, but she's tough as nails, and she sees right through Joe Boscopoulos right from the beginning, or at least she thinks she does. She is not willing to trust this guy who comes in off the streets and just offers to set up this gambling. She tries to tell Veronica Stedman this is not a good idea. We shouldn't join forces with this guy. This is illegal. We're not going to do anything that could get our organization in trouble. But she ends up losing, and he pulls some sleight of hand and manages to convince these women that he really is lucky, he really can't lose, and he manages to help their war relief effort in some small ways. So he gains their trust and manages to get them to agree to go in with him and work on this idea to get the gambling going for their charity event. The idea with him, though, is he's going to put false bottoms in all the cash boxes at the gambling tables, and all of his men will be working the tables. So then at the end of the night, they will pocket most of the money and then just turn over a few $100s to the war relief effort and be like, oh crap, it didn't work, sorry. So he manages to convince them, and they end up doing this gambling night. In the meantime, the partner who reported to the draft but managed to get out of serving in the army because he couldn't pass the physical has come back, and he's holding a grudge against Joe, and so he tries to sabotage this whole thing, and he's looking for a way to get in there and basically take everything for himself. So he's hanging around like a bad penny. In the meantime, Cary Grant's character, Joe, is falling in love with Dorothy, and she's falling in love with him. Against her better judgment, she tries to resist because he's this low-class gambler with no morals and all this stuff. You know, the classical bad boy meets the high society dame, and they fall for each other but try to resist it and all of those things. It's a wonderful film. I'm not going to tell you anymore because I don't want to ruin for you all the switches on switches on switches that go on at the end of the film, and all the back and forth and he said, she said, who ends up with who, etc. So I'm not going to tell you what happens, but that's basically what's going on. Like I said, it has wonderful, wonderful messages in it, including a very patriotic stance, the idea of working together, the idea of resisting evil, and finding, I think the main thing, like I've already mentioned, is this search for finding meaning. And what are you doing that is meaningful? What gives your life meaning? And I would hazard my 2 cents worth is that it's not even like there's one size fits all. Like, we're all going to find meaning in different ways, right? So just because someone else decides to join the military because that's how they find meaning, fighting for their country and defending their home and their family and their loved ones, and that gives them a sense of meaning and purpose, that might be right for some people. That's not going to be right for all of us. We don't all need to join the military. God forbid, right? Like, we all have different roles to play. We're all going to find meaning other ways. I found meaning as a hairstylist for many, many years, and does that mean that everyone who becomes a hairstylist finds meaning in it? No. There's a very high turnover rate in hairdressing jobs, actually. It's very unusual for the majority of people who graduate hair school and even go on to get their license. A lot of them don't stick with it for more than 5 years. So if you hit the 5-year mark and you're still going strong as a hairstylist, you're above the curve and above average, because not everyone finds meaning in that. And that's okay. And you might find meaning in something for a while and then it shifts later on, but there has to be that inner sense of meaning that drives you. So, like, I found meaning as a hairstylist, not because curling hair and coloring hair and cutting things is, like, the best thing ever, although it's really freaking fun. But it's not, the work itself wasn't what gave it meaning. What gave it meaning was my connection to my clients. The fact that I could make the world a more beautiful place. The fact that I could help people look at themselves in the mirror and what they once looked at and saw as ugly or unmeaningful, I could help fix that and help them realize that they are beautiful and that they have meaning, they have beauty, they have things that make them unique. That's what's going on in this film. There's this real search for meaning. There's this one point in the film before they actually get to the charity event that they're planning. He's already got his con game going on, but he hasn't actually implemented it yet. And he's acting out the role of this guy, Joe Boscopoulos. a letter comes to him from Greece, and it's from the real Joe Boskopoulos' family back in Greece. And he takes the letter to a Catholic priest in town because he can't read Greek, and the priest translates the letter for him and reads it to him. And it's basically from this guy's mom, and she's telling him that the Nazis have come into Greece, and there's fighting in their village, and his father and all of his brothers have died, and all of the men in the village, even the boys, stood up to the Nazis, defended their home, defended their food, defended their village, and died and were basically slaughtered. But she's so proud of them because they gave their life for something meaningful. They gave their life to protect people, and they did something that was really good. And so it's painful that they're gone, but she's so proud of them and glad that at least if they had to die in this war, they died in honor. And it really is the turning point for the film because it causes Joe Adams, pretending to be Joe Boskopoulos, it shakes him up, and he gets this glimpse into a bigger story and people who are giving their life for something that means something, giving their life to fight evil and to fight the spread of evil ideas and evil regimes, and to stand up for freedom and justice and for the underdog. And it makes him really question, like, what am I doing with my life? And all I'm out for is myself. All I'm out for is to make some money, and usually to make money by conning people, screwing them out of their money, by tricking them and being deceitful and sneaky and manipulative. And then he has this kind of come to Jesus moment where he's like, holy crap, people are dying to defend my right to be free, and I'm using that freedom to screw over other people. Is that really meaningful? It's a really powerful scene and a really powerful film, I think, and the message is really good. So there are a couple really cute scenes that I wanted to point out to you guys. Besides that big important scene, there's a couple cute funny scenes. You might have noticed my really dorky intro in the beginning. I'm sorry, I'm always probably going to have dorky intros. I keep trying so hard to come up with clever ones, and all I come back to are puns and dorky things. So in the beginning, I mentioned going up the frog and toad and finding a pattern for a tea and food. You might have been like, I think she's having a stroke. What's going on? I'm not having a stroke, I promise. This is my terrible, pitiful, and very bad attempt to get in on a joke from the movie. So there's a scene where Cary Grant's character, who has come up from the streets and the School of Hard Knocks, is teaching this high society dame that he's falling in love with the street slang of Cockney England that he has gotten introduced to. And it comes up in several other films that I watched growing up as a kid, and I don't know where it started. I'm wondering if this movie was the originator, because it's the oldest movie I've seen with a reference to this rhyming slang, but it might be even older, I just don't know. But basically it's a rhyming slang where instead of saying the word that you're talking about, you say something completely different that rhymes with it. So instead of saying, look at my great hat, you'd say like, look at my tit for tat hat. So in the beginning, frog and toad, road. You want to go down the road to vintage knitting. You want to go down the frog and toad? Get it? Also, what was tea and food? Snood. We're going to talk about that in a minute. So there's a lot of cute little things like that. Like a twist and twirl is a girl. My briny marlin is darlin'. It's really, really funny and kind of quirky and weird, but there's this clever little scene, and then it comes up several times throughout the movie, and the high society dame learns to speak in this rhyming slang, and it's real cute. The other scene that is great in this film that I wanted to highlight for you is, where does the knitting occur? Actually, there are several scenes where knitting happens in this, but there's one big scene where it's introduced in the beginning and then it comes up a few more times. So in the beginning of Joe Boskopoulos, who's actually Joe Adams, trying to endear himself to these women and convince them to hitch their star to his wagon and let him do the gambling through their charity, he joins their war relief effort. And in order to gain their trust, he joins the knitting circle that is being taught by a rather rotund elderly woman who's hilarious and delightful and very chipper and cheery. And so he doesn't know how to knit, but they tell him he needs to join the knitting circle. So he sits down to knit for the war relief effort, which was very common and popular during World War II. And she sits him down with these needles, and she's giving him this little lesson and teaching him how to knit, and he is not happy about it. His face is like... I think he even makes a couple derogatory comments about men not knitting or something like that, which is silly because actually during both of the World Wars, World War I and World War II, a huge number of men were knitting, and it was seen as a very manly thing to do for the war effort, actually. Everyone was expected to know how to knit. Men, women, children, old people, and it was specifically something for the elderly, the handicapped who couldn't serve in the war, and the people like women and kids that couldn't go. If you were too young, too old, or in some other way exempt from serving in the military or unable to serve in the military, you were expected to knit for the war effort and send your socks and hats and gloves and sweaters and things over to the soldiers. So the Red Cross distributed free knitting patterns and needles and yarn to people. If you wanted to knit but you couldn't afford the wool, you could often get scraps from your neighbors or from the Red Cross. They would put out free knitting patterns. They had knitting circles, all kinds of things. So it was a very, very big war effort, and there were lots of really old ads you can find now from magazines and advertisements on walls and things like that that all talk about like knitting for the war effort. It's really cool. There's a bunch of, you can still find the old free Red Cross patterns for like socks and gloves and hats and stuff for the soldiers online. They have a lot of free resources online that are actual old patterns. So he joins this knitting circle and he's learning how to knit, and then he manages to rope in a couple of his buddies to knit. My favorite scene, except for the one with Cary Grant learning how to knit, my second favorite scene is after he's managed to rope in one of his underlings that works for him to take over his spot in the knitting circle and learn to knit as well. There's a scene later on where this little guy, who's kind of, he's not the person you would expect to knit. He's kind of like a gangster type with an interesting low-class drawl and kind of older, kind of stocky, and there's a scene with him showing the other thugs, his other gangster friends, how to knit. And it's so hilarious. If you don't watch the entire film, if you only watch one thing, go watch the scene with Cary Grant learning to knit, and then a little bit later where the guy is teaching his gangster friends how to knit, because it's so funny. It's hilarious. Oh my god, I love it. So those are the best parts of the whole movie and the reason why they are featured here. It does come up several times because it's something about the war effort, and then Cary Grant is taking his knitting around with him in the car and things like that, and so it's great. But I loved the quote that the knitting teacher gives to him at one point. He's complaining about how there's a big window right behind where they're learning how to knit, and a bunch of his underlings and gangster friends plus a bunch of just gentlemen on the street are coming over and staring, and they're like pointing and staring and laughing at him because he's the only guy in this group full of women sitting there knitting, and he's getting all flustered and embarrassed and like, men don't do this, you know. And she says, that's okay, you need to just sit down and do it. You're a pioneer, and pioneers are always persecuted because of their great moral bravery. And I thought, what a fantastic quote. I'm gonna like put that on my wall. That's amazing. Pioneers are always persecuted because of their great moral bravery. I love it. If I was good at cross stitch, I'd cross-stitch myself a little wall hanging or something, but I don't know how to do that. Maybe one of these days. So that gives you a lot of great info about this fabulous film. You should totally go watch it. We've talked a little bit about the World War II efforts that were going on, the knitting that was so popular, and there was kind of this idea of make, do, and mend. So 1940s fashions, if you're interested in learning more about knitting fashions, there was rationing going on because of the war effort, so skirts got a lot shorter because there was only so much fabric you could use per item. Most jackets and tops and things like that were very, very low on embellishments. People didn't embellish things a lot. There was a lot more plain, tailored, streamlined, because you didn't have extra fabric and notions and things for all of the extra bedazzling. The bedazzling that did happen tended to be recycled from other old things made at home, etc. Knitting became extremely popular. It was already fairly popular, but it got really popular during World War II because of the war effort, but also because it was a way to inexpensively and relatively quickly make yourself tailored, custom-fit clothing at home that was relatively easy. Because knitting is so elastic, you could make it and it would last you through several seasons and or growth spurts of losing or gaining weight because it would fit you pretty well. It could be unraveled if there was a hole in it. You could either darn it or you could just unravel the whole thing and reknit it into something else. You could unravel last season's old sweaters and reknit it into this season's newer version if you wanted. So it became very, very popular. I chose a couple different patterns to highlight this week because I actually don't have any 1940s tops that I'm really proud of right now. The one that I'm wearing under here is actually more of a 1950s style. It's from Amy Apple, and we're not going to talk about it a ton here because it can go for the 1940s because it has a lot of crossover, but it's really more of a 1950s style. But I wore my Fair Isle, which is my Damiaka Lopa this week, because even though this uses all modern colors and is a modern pattern, Fair Isle was very, very popular during World War II. The reason being that you could use a lot of odds and ends, leftover wools, scraps, or unraveled old sweaters to knit these complex color patterns with very little wool. So it made your wool go faster or go farther while making it look a lot more decorative and cool. Also, during the 1940s, there was this big upsurge, partly because of the war and people traveling to fight in the war and things like that, and a lot of refugees from other countries coming to the United States to escape the war. There was a very big multicultural surge where people were learning more about other cultures and were getting very into folk traditions and folk costume and like learning about the traditional costumes and food and things of other cultures. So there was a really big like Alpine and Tyrolean like boom during the 1940s from like the Swiss Alps and places around there. There was a big surge in like Fair Isle and Scottish knits, as well as like the Swedish and Norwegian knits and those types of styles, things like that. So it got to be a very big, like, particularly European cultural, but also there was quite a big influx of Pacific Island culture and Japanese culture and things like that. So it was a very big multicultural time of like stirring up the pot and getting people to spread out a little bit more and become more aware of some of these other places, especially at the end of the war when soldiers started bringing home souvenirs from the places they'd been fighting in and stuff like that. So Fair Isle got very, very popular. So I'm wearing that. I will put a link to the Damiaka Lopa pattern below. We're not going to talk about it a ton because I've already talked about it on the podcast before, but that's kind of what's going on. However, I am working on a project that I am knitting right now. I just started it, so it's not gotten very far, but I wanted to show you the pattern and where you can go get it. The pattern that I am pairing as our official paired pattern that you can knit while you're watching Mr. Lucky is this snood. It's called the Very 1940s Snood, and it comes from this book, Modern Knits Vintage Style. I'm actually not a huge fan of this book. It's okay. I certainly think it's worth looking at, especially if you're into vintage style. There are a couple great patterns. I love this jacket that's on the front here. But my opinion with this is it was a great idea because it's a bunch of different designers, and they took an old vintage pattern, in most cases, like an authentic pattern. Here's a picture of an old snood from the 40s. And they would take a vintage pattern inspiration and then create a modern updated version of that pattern, but with a slight vintage flair. So it's supposed to look kind of vintagey without being like hardcore vintage. There are some really cute little tops and sweaters, a few little cute accessories, but the majority of the patterns in here are either not that great, or even the ones that look awesome, I'm like, okay, that's all right, but it's a little more of like a timeless classic design that looks just as modern as it does old, or sometimes they just look straight up modern and they don't look old at all to me. And so I don't really see the translation from vintage into the now being, I don't see it retaining the vintage feel. The 1940s snood is one of the few that I feel really retains the feel. Unfortunately, this is the only picture of the object itself, so I can't show you any more. I did look on Ravelry, and unfortunately this pattern is not available on Ravelry. It is only available as part of this book. However, I will put a link to this book below as much as I can. I think you can still get it on Amazon, so I'll probably link that, or if I can't find it on there, I'll put whatever link I can find. I think you can also get this on KnitPicks. So that's the one that I'm using. Since I could not find it on Ravelry, and I honestly only mildly recommend this book, like I said, it could be worth it. I found it for like a few dollars at my local half-price bookstore used, and so it was worth a few dollars to get a used copy that's in decent shape. There's a couple things in here I will enjoy knitting, but it's not something where I would go out and just like go crazy looking for it. That might just be my personal opinion. You might like it a lot, and that's totally fine. But if you're looking for a more authentically vintage look, I would skip this one and go for some of the others. So I am going to link to a Ravelry search that I did below of 1940s snood styles. Some of them are knitting, some of them are crochet, so that way you've got both the knitting and crochet options. So I will link to that search below. There were at least 4 or 5 patterns that came up for me on Ravelry, and at least one of them was free. I think a couple of them were free. There were a couple that were only available as part of a book, but you could get it as an ebook, so if you can't find it in a hardcover, you can get it online at least. So I will link to that below, and you can check out the different snood styles and see which one works best for you. But the one that I'm knitting uses a fingering weight skein, and you can get 2 snoods out of a full skein of 100 grams of fingering weight yarn, which is part of what I liked about it. And I'm in the middle of the short row section, so I apologize, it's a little hard to see what I'm doing. But basically you're knitting a garter stitch band, and then the body of it is going to be this really loose, lacy, open, kind of fishnetty looking lace with just a lot of holes. And the idea is you make this kind of like loose, stretchy bag. Basically, a snood is a bag for your hair. It sounds ridiculous, but the word snood actually comes from, I don't remember which language it is, but it came from a language and from an original word that meant bag. So it looks like a bag that hangs off the back of your head. And it was very popular in the 1940s because women would tie their hair up when they went to work in the factories, and a lot of men being drafted for war meant that more women were getting into the workforce. They worked in factories, offices, handyman jobs, etc. And as more and more women got out and worked outside of the home, a lot of times the big, elaborate, fabulous hairdos that were popular at that time were very dangerous around factory equipment, or they were just hot and in your way, and all of your curl would fall out if you're doing something like being a plumber. So in order to work these jobs that their men had done before, a lot of women would tie up their hair in scarves or in snoods. And that way they could put the snood or the scarf over their pin curls, over their rollers, or they could style out their hair and then put it under something to protect it from dust, grime, sweat, etc., and get it off their neck. So this was a very, very popular style. One of my favorite hairstyles when I'm having a bad hair day is to put 2 victory rolls, either 1 or 2. This is a victory roll, by the way. You coil the hair up and leave the end open and pin it in place. And a very 1940s look that I love to do for a bad hair day is to put 1 on each side of my head, or just 1 big one, and then pull the rest back into a snood, and you put the bag over, and then you can't really, you can see the hair through the holes, but you can't really tell if it's curled or styled at all. So sometimes I'll use it when I don't want to do all of my hair. I seriously, when I do that, I just do the front third of my hair, and the back 2/3 I put in a snood, and I pin a cute little flower on it, and you cannot even tell. It looks totally like I've done something really amazing. Every time I wear my snoods, with like a victory roll or something in it as well, even if it's something super simple, I get so many compliments on it all day long. I get men literally like turning their head and being like, oh, I like your hair. I get women coming up to me in the grocery store going, girl, I love your hair, let me see it. Like, people love it. All ages, all genders, all types, all styles. I've had like goth teenagers tell me that my snood was cool in the mall, and then a little old grandma in her like church hat right around the corner being like, oh, I love your snood. And everybody loves it, and it's so easy. So you should all be knitting a snood if you have longer than pixie hair, because it is amazing. You don't have to do all your hair that way. I am using a skein of my Glitterati fingering, which is my super blingy base. I'm actually trying to decide if I'm going to keep this in the shop right now, because I brought this in to kind of test it several months ago, and it sold okay, but it just hasn't been super popular. It's extremely blingy because it uses lurex instead of stellina. My Seductress base that's already in the shop that is definitely staying because I'm obsessed with it and it's my favorite. It's more finicky to dye, so it takes more time and effort dyeing it, and it's a much more subtle stellina blend. The stellina is a very subtle sparkle to the yarn, so it is sparkly, but it's very subtle. And this one is like blingy, like diamonds. It's just, there's no getting away from the fact that this has sparkle in it. So I don't know if you guys can see that too well, but that is the lurex sparkle base. Like I said, I'm undecided about whether this will stay in the shop. If it does, it's not going to be in the shop all the time and not on every colorway. It's just going to be the occasional thing here or there. But I do love the feel of it. It's really, really nice. It's very squishy. It's got nylon in it, so it's a great sock blend. And even though this one, I was worried this one would be a little rough because the bling in it is so much more intense than the stellina I normally do. You can't even feel the stellina at all. It's not scratchy. You can't feel it at all. It's just very soft. I was worried this one would be a little scratchy when I first got it, but after having knit with it and worked with it, I can confidently tell you it's soft enough for baby skin. It's not going to feel scratchy or less squishy or soft at all. It doesn't make it crunchy or anything like that. I'm just not sure if I love how blingy it is. I actually love it for the snood. I think it's going to look really phenomenal as a little snood or hat. I don't know about it for just everything. Like, I don't know about shawls or sweaters, but I do love it. So yeah, I haven't gotten very far, but I'm really excited to try it. I did actually try knitting this pattern years and years and years ago. I wasn't as good back then, so I never finished it. I started working on it, I got about 2/3 of the way through and was like, this isn't looking right. And I think it's because, I'm being perfectly honest, this pattern is not very well written in my opinion. I hate to give a negative review to anything, I really do, but I have to be super honest with you guys. Like I said, this book is not my favorite. You could give it a miss and not miss too much, but it's worth looking at. but this pattern is very poorly written. It's very confusing. I feel like they'll give you instructions and then they'll just be like, for the next 13 rows, do this. And it's like, okay, I guess I see that, but like I had to read that several times to figure out if that's what it said. They'll give you a chart and be like, and just add one on from the held stitches each row until you've incorporated all the stitches, which sounds easy, but the way they wrote the chart, I was looking in here and like there's brackets around the repeat section of the chart, right? Everyone does that, right? So you do this, go back and repeat it until you get to the end of that section. And then you usually have like your border stitches. I'm doing that right now. But instead of having just like the markers on either side of the repeats, they have like the repeat section blocked off, and then they have a couple more stitches and then another line, and it says that in the key it says this is where the marker goes. Seemed pretty simple, but then I was having trouble as you're like adding on and changing stitch counts. The markers like kind of move around a little bit, and I was having a really hard time following because what was making sense logically when I read my knitting, like Elizabeth Zimmerman teaches you how to do it, is not matching up with their pattern, and their pattern isn't consistent on the rows, so I'm having trouble finding like the rhythm of it. It's very difficult. So I'm not gonna lie, I don't love this pattern. If you keep watching my podcast, I will update you in a few weeks. Hopefully I will figure this out and I'll let you know if I'm able to complete this pattern. I'm giving it another try because when I knit it before, I was really not as good as I am now. It was literally like 8 or 9 years ago, and I'm much better at knitting and reading charts and things than I used to be. So I have a lot of confidence that I was just inexperienced and I will be better now, but I'm a little worried about it. Okay, so that's our pattern that we paired with it, but I did want to show you one other thing that I tried. So I've talked in here before, excuse me, Phoebe, about knitting from old vintage patterns. I love to do that. Old vintage patterns are phenomenal. You can find great things. Like I have this old 1940s, it's actually 1940s and early 50s. I think it came out in like 53 or something, but it's a book of knitting patterns, and it's got fabulous ones like this gal here in this fabulous little sweater. I'm actually working on knitting this right now. I started it years ago and I keep putting it down for literally like a year or two and then losing my place and starting over. And it's not going super well, but I think I had a breakthrough recently and I'm probably gonna rip it out and re-knit, but I'm trying to write a new pattern inspired by this photo, but the instructions, like many vintage patterns, are actually not very helpful or very accurate. So I'm finding a lot of things that aren't working and a lot of stitch counts off, math being off, stuff that doesn't make sense, a lot of extra steps where I'm like, I don't know why you would need to do that. And I feel like it's written in pieces and then seamed together, and I'm trying to figure out if that's better to do that or if I can figure out a way to do it in the round. So I'm going to put that one down and work on it later. But another pattern I did years and years ago, it was before I was married, so I want to say this was probably 8 years ago, 8 or 9. I found an old vintage pattern for a 1940s sweater that had this really cute little square neckline and these puff sleeves, and I just thought it was adorable. So I bought some Knit Picks yarn because at the time I had no money for fancy yarn, and so I bought some inexpensive Knit Picks fingering yarn in a superwash merino, and I knit this cute little vintagey top. It actually came out pretty well, especially considering that at the time I had never done that before. I'd never rewritten a vintage pattern. I had no idea what I was doing. I had nobody to help me. I didn't have any of the resources I do now online because I just wasn't online, and I didn't have a knitting community or a knitting group or anything to ask for help. So I did it all on my own. So it turned out pretty well. The problem is my sleeve, I didn't know how to sew seams at the time. I'm still not great with them, but I'm a lot better now. I didn't know how to sew seams, so my puff sleeves are really uneven and really dorky. The yarn I used was kind of cheap and not the best. It was a little too limp and relaxed and a little too superwash for this particular sweater that needed a bit more structure. So I think I should have done a better job with that. I love how the little buttons came out on the back neckline. Frequently in vintage patterns, they will have a really tight high neckline, so they will have you put in buttonholes and buttons at the neck so that you open them to fit it over your head, and then once it's in place you button them up, and it makes this cute pretty little vintage detail. And I used real vintage buttons. They're not expensive, but I used some vintage 1960s buttons from my great grandma's sewing kit to sew onto there. I really love it. The problem is when I knit it, I was a lot skinnier than I am now, and even at that time I didn't take my measurements correctly, so I technically could fit it, but it wasn't comfortable because it was so tight on this bottom cast off. I didn't know that there was such a thing as a stretchy bind off at the time. I just bound off normally, and so it's really tight. And I am a little bit bustier now than I used to be. So it's still technically, I can get it on, and I almost wore it today, but it was just so ugly. And it was like riding up really high because I didn't knit the body long enough, and the boobs are like real stretched and tight. And I was like, I really don't want to look like that. So I've actually made the difficult decision that I'm going to recycle the buttons and throw this away because the yarn is kind of pilling and gross anyways. It was cheap and inexpensive yarn anyways. I don't love it, but I did love the crazy fun color and I loved the experience, and I'm going to try to reknit this pattern. Unfortunately, I didn't save my notes or write it down anywhere, so I'm going to have to try and refigure it back out, but that's probably going to go on the majorly a long ways from now to do pile. But I wanted to show you that I do really love working on these old patterns, and I think that you should make do and mend whenever possible, but there are sometimes that knits just aren't worth keeping. This was a good learning experience, but it is just not worth keeping. So I'm going to recycle the buttons because I like them and they're worthwhile, and then the rest is just going to go in the garbage, and that's okay. It's okay. We can throw things away or donate them to someone who will use them. If I was really 1940s, I would recycle the yarn, but I'm not going to lie. That yarn was not expensive enough for me to even bother with the hours of ripping it back out. I'm just going to move on to something else. So that's what I'm working on for my 40s knits. I hope you guys have a great time with watching Mr. Lucky. I hope you find some great snoods to knit. You have some fun with the history and the interesting facts about World War II. And if you have not ordered your yarn club for Cary Grant, you can still get it. It is live through the 15th. On the morning of the 16th, it'll be taken down, so you will no longer be able to order it. Please keep in mind this is a dyed to order club, which means that none of the skeins will be dyed until everyone's order is in. Once the 16th hits, I will close it, I will tally up the orders, and it will get added to my queue of dyeing. I always tend to ship out early, but I do recommend that you not expect it to ship until the 1st of the next month. So it probably won't ship until March 1st. That's the guaranteed date. Whenever possible, however, I do ship it early. And like last month for Rosalind Russell, it wasn't supposed to ship until the 31st of January, but I think I got it out on like the 24th or something like that, 25th maybe. It shipped a few days early, and I do that whenever possible, but I do wait until I get everybody's order done and then I ship it out. If you miss it by the 15th, I'm so sorry. There is no late joining into the club. That's just not how it works. And it just has to do with me having to keep on my dyeing schedule as much as possible, and the fact that this is designed to be an exclusive limited edition club. So if you miss the limited edition, I'm sorry, that's all there is. The wonderful thing about this yarn club is you don't have to sign up. If you are strapped for cash, I get it. I've been there too. Hence why I used really cheap, probably the wrong type of yarn for this sweater. I don't always have the budget for fancy, expensive things as well, and I totally understand that. So this is set up as a one-time purchase club. Each month you just purchase that month's club, and you are not, your card will not get charged the next month. You won't have any surprises. You won't have to remember to cancel a subscription because it's not a subscription. It's a pre-order, if that makes any sense. It's just a pre-order for a limited time, and it's an exclusive colorway. All right, I hope that helps you guys make some decisions, and I look forward to our next film. Be sure that you leave me a comment below and telling me what you liked about this, and letting me know if you have any suggestions for our films or any suggestions for vintage patterns as well. If you have any 1940s specific patterns that you think I should check out, please feel free to leave me a comment. Let me know. I'm always looking for good ones. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. It is now time to cast off. Love you.